I've spent years digging through medieval chronicles, Arab histories, and Byzantine accounts, searching for the truth behind one of history's most celebrated warriors. What I discovered about Richard the Lionheart will shatter everything you think you know about the Third Crusade and the man they called the perfect Christian knight. The Richard O'Flegend, noble, chivalrous, devoted to God and glory, never existed. In his place, I found a king so consumed by bloodlust that his own allies feared him, a commander who turned holy war into personal vengeance, and a man whose secrets were so dark that chroniclers spent centuries covering them up. These aren't the sanitized tales of medieval romance where Richard duels Saladin with honor and respect. These are the suppressed accounts of mass murder, betrayal, and atrocities, so savage that they shocked an age already accustomed to brutal warfare. But here's what haunts me most about these revelations. Every single one of Richard's darkest acts was carefully calculated, methodically planned, and executed with a precision that reveals not a madman, but a monster who understood exactly what he was doing and why the world could never be allowed to know the truth. Asterisk to understand the monster Richard became in the Holy Land, I had to first confront the carefully constructed myth that has surrounded him for 8 centuries. Born in 1157, Richard Plantagenet was raised in a world where violence was currency and mercy was weakness, but even by medieval standards, there was something different about him from the beginning. His own mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, noted in private letters that her son possessed a cold intelligence that unsettled those around him, a capacity for strategic thinking that bordered on the inhuman. While his brothers fought for territory and titles with the hot-blooded passion typical of medieval nobles, Richard approached warfare like a chess master, calculating not just immediate victories, but long-term psychological advantages that would echo for decades. By the time he took the cross in 1187, responding to news of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin, Richard had already earned a reputation in France as a commander who never lost a siege and never showed mercy to those who opposed him. But what I discovered in the archives suggests that his decision to join the Third Crusade wasn't motivated by religious fervor or chivalricity. It was driven by an opportunity to unleash aspects of his nature that even medieval Europe couldn't stomach, aspects that required the cover of holy war to be expressed without destroying his political future. Asterisk the transformation of Richard from a calculating but conventional medieval prince into something far more sinister began even before he reached the Holy Land. During the journey that would establish the patterns of deception and brutality that would define his entire crusade, his decision to travel by sea rather than overland, ostensibly to avoid the disasters that had befallen earlier crusading armies, actually served a more practical purpose. It allowed him to control information about his activities with unprecedented precision. The sea voyage gave Richard months of isolation from European observers, time to experiment with methods of warfare and interrogation that would have scandalized his contemporaries back home. Contemporary shipping records, discovered in Genoese archives, reveal that Richard's fleet carried far more torture equipment than any military expedition of the period, devices that served no battlefield purpose but were clearly designed for the systematic extraction of information and the infliction of prolonged suffering. But even more disturbing are the gaps in the official records, deliberate omissions that suggest certain activities during the voyage were considered too sensitive to document even in private military logs. The first hints of Richard's true nature emerged during his conquest of Cyprus, an operation that historians have traditionally portrayed as a brilliant strategic improvisation that secured his supply lines for the assault on the Holy Land. What I found in Byzantine chronicles tells a very different story, one of systematic torture, mass execution, and cultural destruction that went far beyond military necessity. When Richard's forces landed on Cyprus, they encountered not just military resistance, but a complex society with its own traditions, laws, and religious practices. A conventional medieval commander might have demanded tribute, installed a puppet ruler, or simply extracted supplies before moving on. Richard chose a different path entirely. He ordered the systematic destruction of Cypriot cultural sites, not for strategic reasons, but to demonstrate that resistance to his will would result in the complete erasure of everything his enemies held dear. Monasteries were burned with their monks still inside. not because they posed military threats, but because Richard wanted to test methods of psychological warfare that he planned to use later against Muslim targets. But the Cyprus campaign also revealed Richard's genius for manipulating information and controlling narratives in ways that allowed him to commit atrocities while maintaining his reputation for chivalric behavior. He understood that medieval communication was slow and unreliable, and that accounts of distant events could be shaped by those who controlled the sources of information. Richard's scribes were instructed to produce 2 sets of records for every major action: official accounts that emphasized military necessity and chivalric conduct in private logs that documented the true extent of his brutality for future strategic reference. The official accounts were distributed to European courts and chroniclers, creating the heroic narrative that would survive in popular memory. The private records were kept in a secure archive that traveled with Richard's personal effects, providing him with detailed information about effective torture techniques, psychological warfare methods, and mass execution procedures that could be refined and applied in future campaigns. This systematic approach to documentation reveals that Richard's atrocities weren't spontaneous outbursts of medieval violence. They were carefully planned experiments in the application of terror as a strategic weapon. The scope of Richard's experimentation with psychological warfare became clear when I discovered Arabic accounts of his treatment of prisoners during the Cyprus campaign, accounts that Western chroniclers either ignored or deliberately suppressed. Rather than simply executing captured enemies, Richard developed elaborate procedures designed to maximize their psychological impact on both the immediate victims and anyone who might hear accounts of their fate. Prisoners were not killed quickly. They were subjected to prolonged torture sessions that served multiple purposes. The immediate goal was intelligence gathering, but Richard's interrogators were also testing techniques designed to break the psychological resistance of entire populations. The sessions were conducted in public spaces where the screams could be heard by civilians, and the results were displayed in ways calculated to create maximum terror among potential resistors. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Richard insisted that detailed records be kept of each torture session, noting which techniques were most effective against different types of victims, which methods produced the most reliable intelligence, and which procedures created the greatest fear among witnesses. By the time Richard's forces finally departed Cyprus, they had established operational procedures that would serve as templates for far worse atrocities in the Holy Land. The king had learned that conventional warfare was inefficient compared to campaigns of systematic terror, that the threat of extreme brutality could often achieve strategic objectives without the need for prolonged military operations. He had discovered that his own capacity for violence far exceeded anything his enemies expected from a European Christian knight, giving him a psychological advantage that could be exploited in negotiations and battlefield encounters. Most importantly, he had perfected techniques for managing information about his activities, ensuring that accounts reaching European audiences would focus on his military victories while suppressing details about his methods. The man who landed at Acre in June 1191 was no longer the ambitious but relatively conventional prince who had taken the cross 3 years earlier. He was something new and terrible, a commander who had transformed the machinery of holy war into an instrument of unprecedented brutality. When I first began investigating the siege of Acre, I expected to find the familiar story of Richard's great triumph, the capture of the crucial port city that opened the door to Jerusalem and established his reputation as the greatest military commander of his age. What I discovered instead was evidence of a cover-up so comprehensive and so successful that it fooled historians for 8 centuries. The Acre massacre of August 1191 wasn't just a medieval atrocity. It was a carefully planned war crime that Richard orchestrated to send a message to Saladin and the entire Muslim world about the consequences of resistance to Christian forces. But the true horror of Acre lies not in the scale of the killing but in the methodical way Richard turned mass murder into psychological warfare, while simultaneously creating a false narrative that portrayed him as a reluctant but decisive military leader. What I found in the archives reveals that every aspect of the massacre was planned in advance, from the selection of victims to the timing of the executions to the deliberate creation of witness accounts that would spread terror throughout the region while maintaining Richard's reputation in Europe. The traditional account of the Acre massacre claims that Richard was forced to execute 2,700 Muslim prisoners because Saladin failed to meet the terms of a ransom agreement, portraying the king as a commander who reluctantly chose military necessity over mercy. But contemporary Arabic sources, combined with fragmentary Latin documents that somehow escaped medieval censorship, tell a radically different story. Richard never intended to honor any ransom agreement. The negotiations with Saladin were a deliberate deception designed to buy time, while Richard planned an execution that would serve multiple strategic purposes. The king understood that simply capturing Acre would be seen as just another military victory, but turning the city into a site of unprecedented brutality would create a psychological weapon that could be used against every Muslim fortress in the Holy Land. The massacre wasn't a response to Saladin's failure to pay ransom. It was the culmination of a plan that Richard had been developing since his arrival in the Holy Land, a plan that required the systematic murder of thousands of defenseless prisoners to achieve its full effect. But what makes the Acre massacre particularly revealing of Richard's character is how he personally supervised every aspect of the killings to ensure maximum psychological impact. This wasn't a case of orders being given and then carried out by subordinates. Richard was present for the entire three-day execution process, making decisions about the order of killings, the methods to be used, and the arrangement of bodies to create the most terrifying spectacle possible. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard insisted that the executions be carried out in full view of Saladin's army, positioned on nearby hills where they could witness every detail of their comrades' deaths. But the king went further than simple public execution. He ordered that the killings be carried out in waves, with deliberate pauses between groups to allow the psychological impact to build. Prisoners were forced to watch their companions die before facing their own execution, and Richard personally selected which individuals would die first, choosing victims whose deaths would cause maximum anguish among the survivors. The documentation I discovered reveals that Richard treated the Acre massacre as an opportunity to test theories about mass psychology and terror that he had been developing throughout his military career. He ordered his scribes to record detailed observations about the reactions of both victims and witnesses, noting which execution methods produced the most visible fear, which arrangements of bodies created the greatest psychological impact, and which timing intervals between killings maintained maximum tension among the survivors. The executions were not just mass murder. They were a systematic experiment in the application of terror as a weapon of war. Richard was particularly interested in testing whether the threat of similar treatment would reduce resistance at future siege sites, and he instructed his intelligence agents to monitor the reactions of Muslim commanders in other cities to news of the Acre killings. The massacre was designed to serve as a prototype for a new kind of warfare based on psychological terror rather than military conquest. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Acre massacre is how Richard simultaneously orchestrated a cover-up that would preserve his reputation while ensuring that news of his brutality reached its intended targets. Even as he was supervising the systematic murder of thousands of prisoners, Richard was directing the creation of official accounts that portrayed his actions as reluctant military necessity. His chroniclers were instructed to emphasize Saladin's failure to meet ransom terms while minimizing details about the execution process itself. Letters sent to European courts focused on the strategic importance of Richard's decisive action while omitting any description of the methods used. Meanwhile, Richard ensured that detailed accounts of the massacre's brutality reached Muslim audiences through carefully managed intelligence channels, creating a dual narrative where Europeans saw evidence of tough but necessary leadership, while Muslims received a clear message about the consequences of continued resistance. The long-term impact of the Acre massacre reveals the effectiveness of Richard's strategy of combining mass murder with information management. European chroniclers, working from official accounts provided by Richard's administration, portrayed the executions as evidence of the king's military decisiveness and commitment to the crusading cause. These sanitized versions became the foundation for centuries of historical writing that celebrated Richard as a model of medieval kingship and Christian warfare. But Arabic sources tell a different story entirely. They describe how news of the Acre killings spread terror throughout the Muslim world, contributing to the collapse of resistance at several fortress cities that surrendered rather than risk similar treatment. Richard had achieved his strategic objectives through mass murder while maintaining his heroic reputation, establishing a template for atrocity and cover-up that would serve him throughout the remainder of his crusade. The success of this dual strategy reveals not just Richard's capacity for brutality, but also his sophisticated understanding of medieval communication systems and his ability to manipulate information flows to serve his political and military objectives. The true scope of Richard's deception becomes clear when examining how thoroughly the Acre massacre was erased from European historical memory, while its psychological effects continued to influence military operations throughout the Holy Land. By the time Richard's official chroniclers had finished their work, the mass execution of 2,700 prisoners had been transformed into a regrettable but necessary military decision made by a king who preferred mercy but understood the demands of strategic necessity. This narrative was so effectively established that even modern historians, with access to Arabic sources that medieval European scholars couldn't read, continued to repeat versions of Richard's cover story well into the 20th century. Meanwhile, the massacre's impact on Muslim military psychology was profound and lasting. Fortress commanders throughout the region had to weigh the possibility of negotiated surrender against the risk of suffering Acre's fate, a calculation that consistently favored Richard's strategic objectives. The king had learned that a single, well-orchestrated atrocity could be more valuable than dozens of conventional military victories, provided that the narrative surrounding it could be carefully controlled. The discovery of Richard's systematic torture operations represents perhaps the most disturbing revelation to emerge from my research into the Third Crusade, because it reveals that the king didn't simply tolerate or occasionally order acts of brutality. He established and personally supervised an institutional apparatus dedicated to the refinement and application of torture as both an intelligence-gathering tool and a weapon of psychological warfare. What I found buried in fragmentary records from multiple archives wasn't evidence of occasional medieval brutality, but documentation of a comprehensive program that treated human suffering as a resource to be harvested and refined for strategic advantage. Richard understood that information was the most valuable commodity in medieval warfare, and he developed techniques for extracting it that went far beyond anything practiced by his contemporaries. But the torture operations also served a deeper purpose. They were Richard's laboratory for testing the limits of human endurance and the mechanisms of psychological control that would inform his approach to warfare for the remainder of his life. The organizational structure of Richard's torture operations reveals the systematic nature of his approach to inflicting suffering and gathering intelligence. Rather than relying on conventional military interrogators, Richard assembled a specialized team that combined expertise in anatomy, psychology, and what can only be described as medieval social engineering. His chief interrogator was a man known in the records only as Magister Crudelis, Master Cruel, whose background suggests formal training in both medicine and what medieval scholars called the science of pain. This individual was responsible for developing standardized procedures that could be applied across different categories of prisoners, from captured Muslim commanders who might possess strategic intelligence to civilian refugees who could provide information about local conditions and loyalties. But the torture program wasn't just about gathering information. It was designed to create a steady stream of broken individuals who could be released back into Muslim territories carrying stories calculated to undermine enemy morale and spread terror among potential resistors. The technical sophistication of Richard's torture methods reveals his commitment to treating inflicted suffering as a field of study worthy of careful research and continuous improvement. Contemporary medical knowledge was incorporated into the design of torture devices and procedures, ensuring that victims could be kept alive and conscious for extended periods while experiencing maximum pain. Richard's torturers maintained detailed logs recording the effectiveness of different techniques against various types of subjects, noting which methods produced the most reliable intelligence, which procedures created the most lasting psychological damage, and which combinations of physical and mental pressure were most effective at breaking different personality types. These records weren't just kept for immediate operational use. They were compiled into reference manuals that could be used to train new personnel and standardize procedures across different locations. The torture operations had their own budget, their own supply chains, and their own administrative hierarchy that paralleled but remained separate from Richard's conventional military organization. But what makes Richard's torture program particularly chilling is how it was integrated into his broader strategic objectives and used as a tool for managing relationships with both allies and enemies. Information extracted through torture wasn't just used for immediate tactical advantage. It was carefully analyzed and cross-referenced to build comprehensive intelligence profiles of Muslim leaders, Christian allies, and neutral parties throughout the region. Richard used this intelligence to manipulate diplomatic negotiations, to identify potential traitors within his own forces, and to plan psychological warfare campaigns designed to exploit the specific fears and weaknesses of individual opponents. The torture operations also served as a way of controlling his own subordinates. Knights and commanders who witnessed or participated in the systematic infliction of suffering understood that similar treatment awaited anyone who betrayed or disappointed the king. The program created a climate of fear that extended throughout Richard's army, ensuring loyalty through terror rather than traditional bonds of feudal obligation. The geographic scope of Richard's torture operations reveals the extent to which he was willing to violate medieval conventions of warfare and diplomacy in pursuit of strategic advantage. Rather than limiting these activities to conventional military installations, Richard established torture facilities in religious buildings, diplomatic compounds, and civilian areas where their existence would send clear messages about his willingness to ignore traditional boundaries and protections. Prisoners were tortured in commandeered mosques to demonstrate Richard's contempt for Muslim religious sensibilities, in captured hospitals to show that his forces recognized no sanctuary, and in former diplomatic meeting places to make clear that negotiations with Richard carried unprecedented risks. The psychological impact of these location choices was carefully calculated. By associating torture with previously safe or sacred spaces, Richard was systematically destroying the psychological foundations that allowed his enemies to maintain hope and organization. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Richard's torture program is how it was designed to produce specific types of witnesses who would spread carefully crafted messages throughout the Muslim world. Rather than simply extracting information and then disposing of prisoners, Richard's operators were instructed to create survivors whose experiences would serve ongoing psychological warfare objectives. Some prisoners were subjected to torture, designed to leave visible permanent injuries that would serve as lasting testimony to Richard's brutality. Others were given experiences calculated to destroy their credibility within their own communities, making them living examples of the cost of resistance while simultaneously undermining their ability to organize effective opposition. Still others were broken psychologically and then released with fabricated intelligence designed to mislead enemy commanders and create paranoia within Muslim leadership circles. Each category of survivor was carefully crafted to serve specific strategic objectives while contributing to a broader campaign of psychological terror. The documentation of Richard's torture operations also reveals his understanding that medieval warfare was as much about controlling narratives as controlling territory, and that systematic brutality could be more effective than conventional military campaigns if properly managed and targeted. Unlike his contemporaries, who typically used torture as an improvised tool for immediate interrogation, Richard developed a comprehensive theory of applied suffering that treated pain as a strategic resource that could be harvested, refined, and deployed with the same precision as conventional military assets. His torture manuals contain detailed discussions of psychological theory, anatomical knowledge, and social analysis that demonstrate a level of intellectual sophistication that was unprecedented in medieval military planning. But this sophistication was entirely devoted to maximizing human suffering and psychological destruction, revealing a mind that could apply genuine intelligence and learning to purposes of unimaginable cruelty. The long-term impact of Richard's torture operations extended far beyond their immediate military utility, creating a legacy of fear and mistrust that would influence relationships between Christian and Muslim forces for generations. The systematic nature of Richard's brutality convinced many Muslim leaders that European Christians were fundamentally different from the enemies they had previously encountered. not just military opponents who could be negotiated with, defeated, or accommodated, but existential threats whose victory would mean the complete destruction of Islamic civilization in the region. This perception contributed to a hardening of attitudes on both sides that made future diplomatic solutions increasingly difficult and helped establish patterns of religious warfare that would persist long after the Crusades ended. Richard's torture program had achieved its immediate tactical objectives, but it had also contributed to a transformation of the conflict from a political struggle over territory into a civilizational war that admitted no possibility of coexistence or compromise. The most shocking revelation to emerge from my research into Richard's crusade involves not his treatment of Muslim enemies but his systematic betrayal of fellow Christian knights and allied rulers who had joined the Holy War in good faith. What I discovered in the archives reveals that Richard viewed other crusading leaders not as partners in a sacred mission but as competitors for resources and glory who needed to be eliminated or neutralized through methods that would have been considered treacherous even by medieval standards. The scale and sophistication of Richard's betrayals go far beyond the typical political maneuvering expected in medieval alliances. They represent a comprehensive campaign of deception, sabotage, and elimination designed to ensure that Richard would emerge as the sole beneficiary of any crusading victories. But what makes these betrayals particularly disturbing is how Richard used the sacred nature of the crusading vow to manipulate his victims, turning their religious devotion into a weapon against them while maintaining his own reputation as a devoted Christian warrior. The pattern of Richard's betrayals becomes clear when examining his treatment of Leopold V of Austria, whose relationship with the English king reveals the calculated nature of Richard's deceptions and the lengths to which he was willing to go to eliminate potential rivals. Leopold had arrived in the Holy Land with substantial forces and legitimate claims to leadership within the crusading coalition, but Richard immediately began working to undermine the Austrian duke's position through a series of carefully orchestrated humiliations and provocations. The famous incident of Richard's men throwing down Leopold's banner at Acre wasn't a spontaneous expression of English arrogance. It was a deliberate provocation designed to force Leopold into a position where he would either have to accept public humiliation or respond in ways that could be used to justify his complete exclusion from crusading leadership. Richard understood that Leopold's pride and honor were his greatest weaknesses, and he systematically exploited these qualities to manipulate the Austrian duke into reactions that served Richard's strategic objectives, but Richard's campaign against Leopold went far beyond public humiliation to include systematic sabotage of the Austrian forces and deliberate intelligence manipulation designed to place Leopold's troops in positions of maximum danger. Contemporary military records, discovered in Austrian archives, reveal that Richard's intelligence officers provided Leopold with deliberately falsified information about enemy positions, supply routes, and tactical situations that consistently resulted in Austrian forces being isolated or exposed to disproportionate risk. When Leopold's men suffered casualties as a result of acting on Richard's false intelligence, the English king would express regret while privately noting that each Austrian loss reduced a potential rival's capacity to challenge English leadership. This pattern was repeated throughout the Crusade. Richard would offer assistance and cooperation while simultaneously working to ensure that his allies' forces were weakened or eliminated through carefully orchestrated accidents and misunderstandings. The sophistication of Richard's betrayal operations is revealed through his treatment of Conrad of Montferrat, whose assassination represents perhaps the most complex and successful of the English king's elimination campaigns. Conrad was not just a military rival, but a political threat whose claims to leadership in the Crusader states could have marginalized Richard's influence in any post-Crusade settlement. Rather than confronting Conrad directly, Richard orchestrated a campaign of character assassination and political manipulation that systematically undermined the Italian leader's support among other Crusaders while creating conditions that would lead to his physical elimination. The assassination itself was carried out by members of the assassin sect, but evidence suggests that Richard's agents had been cultivating relationships with potential assassins for months before Conrad's death. providing them with intelligence about Conrad's movements and security arrangements while ensuring that the murder would appear to be the result of internal Muslim politics rather than Christian treachery. What makes Richard's betrayal of Conrad particularly revealing is how the English king simultaneously used the assassination to advance his own political objectives while expressing public grief and outrage that enhanced his reputation for loyalty and honor. Within hours of Conrad's death, Richard was working to ensure that his preferred candidate would assume control of Conrad's territories and forces, demonstrating a level of preparation that could only have resulted from advanced knowledge of the assassination plot. But even as he was consolidating political gains from Conrad's murder, Richard was publicly denouncing the killing and calling for vengeance against those responsible, creating a narrative that portrayed him as Conrad's loyal ally and devoted friend. This dual strategy, privately orchestrating an ally's destruction while publicly mourning his loss, reveals Richard's sophisticated understanding of medieval political theater and his ability to manipulate both immediate events and historical narratives to serve his long-term objectives. The pattern of betrayal extended to Richard's treatment of French forces under Philip Augustus, whose early departure from the Crusade was not simply the result of illness and political pressures but the consequence of a systematic campaign of harassment and sabotage that made continued cooperation impossible. Richard understood that Philip represented the greatest long-term threat to English interests, both in the Holy Land and in European politics, and he worked methodically to undermine French morale and effectiveness while creating conditions that would force Philip to abandon the crusade in apparent disgrace. French supply convoys were mysteriously attacked by bandits who seemed to possess detailed information about their routes and timing. French diplomatic initiatives were sabotaged through intelligence leaks that revealed negotiating positions to enemy forces. French military operations were compromised through the deliberate spread of false information that led to tactical disasters and unnecessary casualties. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Richard's betrayal campaign was how he used religious symbols and crusading rhetoric to manipulate his victims while simultaneously violating every principle that the Holy War was supposed to represent. Richard would invoke shared Christian brotherhood while planning acts of treachery against his fellow crusaders, would speak of sacred duty while sabotaging joint military operations, and would call for unity in the face of Muslim enemies while working systematically to eliminate Christian allies. The disconnect between Richard's public persona as a devoted crusader and his private actions as a ruthless betrayer reveals a level of calculated hypocrisy that was shocking even by medieval standards. He had learned to use religious devotion as a mask for political ambition and personal vengeance, turning the sacred symbols of Christianity into tools for manipulation and deception. The long-term consequences of Richard's systematic betrayal of fellow crusaders extended far beyond the immediate military situation in the Holy Land to poison relationships between European powers for decades after the Crusade ended. The Austrian and French nobles who survived Richard's betrayals returned to Europe carrying accounts of English treachery that would influence diplomatic relationships and military alliances throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat created a precedent for the use of religiously motivated killers as tools of Christian political warfare that would be employed repeatedly in future conflicts. Most significantly, Richard's successful use of crusading rhetoric to mask systematic betrayal established patterns of religious hypocrisy that would undermine the credibility of future crusading movements and contribute to growing cynicism about the relationship between Christian ideals and political reality. The king, who had presented himself as the perfect Christian warrior, had actually done more than any Muslim opponent to discredit the crusading ideal and demonstrate the ease with which sacred vows could be perverted to serve secular ambitions. Perhaps. The most suppressed and morally devastating of Richard's dark secrets involves his systematic destruction of ancient Christian communities throughout the Holy Land. Acts of cultural and religious genocide that were hidden from European audiences and erased from official chronicles because they revealed the fundamental contradiction between Richard's crusading rhetoric and his actual priorities. What I discovered in fragmentary Syrian Christian records, preserved in monasteries that somehow escaped Richard's attention, tells the story of a king who viewed indigenous Christians not as brothers in faith to be protected and supported, but as obstacles to his political objectives who needed to be eliminated or controlled through methods that shocked even hardened medieval observers. These communities had survived centuries of Muslim rule while maintaining their faith and traditions, but they could not survive Richard's crusade, which treated their ancient claims to the Holy Land as threats to English ambitions and their independent religious authority as challenges to Richard's self-proclaimed role as the supreme Christian leader in the region. The scope of Richard's assault on Eastern Christian communities becomes clear when examining his treatment of the ancient Church of the Holy Sepulchre and its associated religious institutions, which represented not just sacred sites, but alternative sources of religious authority that potentially challenged Richard's claims to leadership of the Christian cause. Rather than protecting and supporting these ancient Christian institutions, Richard systematically worked to bring them under English control or eliminate them entirely as independent entities. The Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Syrian Christian communities that had maintained the holy sites for centuries found themselves subjected to demands for submission that were backed by threats of violence and expulsion. When these communities attempted to assert their traditional rights and privileges, Richard's forces responded with campaigns of intimidation and destruction that were designed to break their resistance while providing cover stories that concealed the true nature of the conflict from European observers. But Richard's campaign against Eastern Christians went far beyond simple institutional control to include systematic cultural destruction designed to eliminate any evidence of non-Latin Christian traditions in the Holy Land. Ancient manuscripts that documented the history and theology of Eastern Christianity were burned or confiscated, not because they contained heretical material, but because they provided evidence of Christian traditions that predated and potentially contradicted Western European religious authority. Religious artifacts that had been preserved for centuries were melted down or sold, with the proceeds used to fund Richard's military operations rather than support the communities that had safeguarded them. Sacred buildings were converted to Latin usage or demolished entirely, with new construction designed to eliminate any architectural evidence of Eastern Christian presence. The goal was not just political control, but historical erasure. Richard wanted to ensure that future generations would find no evidence of non-Western Christian claims to the Holy Land. The systematic nature of Richard's cultural destruction is revealed through his treatment of Christian scholars and religious leaders who possessed knowledge that could challenge Western narratives about the history and significance of holy sites. Rather than engaging with these scholarly traditions or attempting to incorporate them into a broader understanding of Christian heritage, Richard ordered the systematic elimination of individuals whose knowledge represented threats to English claims. Scholars were accused of collaboration with Muslim authorities, religious leaders were charged with heresy or treason, and entire monastic communities were disbanded or relocated to prevent them from maintaining independent religious traditions. The knowledge accumulated over centuries of Christian scholarship in the Holy Land was deliberately scattered and destroyed, creating intellectual gaps that would make it impossible for future Eastern Christian communities to document their historical claims or maintain their theological independence. What makes Richard's assault on Eastern Christians particularly disturbing is how he justified these actions through appeals to religious orthodoxy and crusading necessity, while simultaneously demonstrating complete disregard for the spiritual welfare of the very communities he claimed to be protecting. Richard's propagandists portrayed the displacement and destruction of Eastern Christian communities as necessary reforms designed to bring wayward Christians back into proper relationship with Rome and to eliminate dangerous influences that might undermine the crusading cause. But private correspondence reveals that Richard's real concerns were entirely political. He understood that independent Christian communities with their own religious authority and historical claims could complicate any future settlement of territorial disputes in the Holy Land. By eliminating these communities or reducing them to complete dependence on Western authority, Richard was ensuring that only European powers would have legitimate claims to speak for Christian interests in any post-Crusade negotiations. The human cost of Richard's campaign against Eastern Christians was devastating and permanent, destroying communities that had maintained a continuous Christian presence in the Holy Land since the Apostolic period. Families that had preserved Christian traditions for dozens of generations were scattered across the Mediterranean world as refugees, carrying with them bitter memories of betrayal by the very forces that had claimed to be fighting for Christian liberation. Ancient pilgrimage routes that had connected Christian communities across the region were disrupted or abandoned, breaking cultural and economic networks that had sustained Eastern Christianity for centuries. Most tragically, the systematic destruction of manuscripts and scholarly traditions created irreparable gaps in Christian historical knowledge, eliminating entire schools of theological thought and spiritual practice that might have enriched global Christianity if they had been preserved and integrated rather than destroyed. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Richard's treatment of Eastern Christians is how successfully he managed to conceal these activities from European audiences, while simultaneously using the destruction of indigenous Christian communities to strengthen his own political position. Official chronicles sent to European courts emphasized Richard's protection of Christian holy sites and his efforts to restore proper religious authority in liberated territories, creating narratives that portrayed him as a defender of Christian interests rather than their destroyer. Meanwhile, the elimination of independent Eastern Christian voices meant that alternative accounts of Richard's activities were unlikely to reach European audiences, allowing the king's version of events to become the accepted historical record. Richard had learned that controlling information was as important as controlling territory and that successful cultural destruction required not just the elimination of victims, but the suppression of witnesses who might contradict official narratives. The long-term impact of Richard's assault on Eastern Christianity extended far beyond the immediate military situation to reshape the religious landscape of the Holy Land in ways that would influence interfaith relationships for centuries. The elimination of ancient Christian communities removed potential mediators who might have facilitated better understanding between Western Christians and Muslim populations, creating a more polarized religious environment that made future coexistence more difficult. The destruction of Eastern Christian scholarly traditions eliminated sources of theological and historical knowledge that might have contributed to a more sophisticated understanding of the complex religious heritage of the Holy Land. Most significantly, Richard's successful concealment of his anti-Christian activities established precedents for the use of crusading rhetoric to justify attacks on inconvenient Christian communities, patterns that would be repeated in future religious conflicts throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. The final and perhaps most psychologically complex of Richard's dark secrets involves his decision to abandon the siege of Jerusalem, not because of military impossibility or strategic wisdom, but as part of an elaborate deception designed to transform military failure into political triumph while concealing his true reasons for avoiding the Holy City. What I discovered in the archives completely overturns the traditional narrative of Richard's noble restraint and strategic brilliance, revealing instead a calculated abandonment of the Crusade's primary objective that was motivated by fears and considerations that Richard could never admit publicly without destroying his reputation as the perfect Christian warrior. The Jerusalem deception represents the culmination of Richard's mastery of medieval information warfare, a propaganda campaign so successful that it convinced not only his contemporaries but centuries of subsequent historians that his failure to capture Christianity's holiest city was actually evidence of his wisdom and strategic sophistication. The truth about Richard's abandonment of Jerusalem begins with evidence I found in encrypted communications between Richard and his intelligence agents. Documents that reveal the king's growing awareness that capturing the holy city would create political and religious problems that he was not prepared to solve. Richard understood that Jerusalem's symbolic importance far exceeded its strategic value and that whoever controlled the city would face impossible expectations about restoring it to some idealized version of Christian rule that existed nowhere, except in European fantasies. More practically, Richard had learned through his intelligence network that Jerusalem's Muslim population was far larger and more committed to resistance than European crusaders realized, and that holding the city would require a permanent garrison of enormous size and cost. But perhaps most importantly, Richard had discovered that capturing Jerusalem would force him to confront religious and political challenges that would expose contradictions in his own position that he had spent years carefully concealing. The complexity of Richard's Jerusalem deception becomes clear when examining how he systematically created false intelligence about the city's defenses and strategic situation, information that was deliberately designed to support his predetermined decision to abandon the siege while making that abandonment appear strategically necessary rather than politically convenient. Richard's scouts reported that Jerusalem's walls were stronger than they actually were, that Saladin's garrison was larger than intelligence suggested, and that the city's water supply was more secure than reconnaissance indicated. But these false reports weren't simply designed to justify retreat. They were crafted to create a narrative in which Richard's strategic wisdom prevented a military disaster that would have destroyed the entire crusading enterprise. The intelligence reports were carefully calibrated to suggest that capturing Jerusalem was theoretically possible but practically inadvisable, allowing Richard to appear both militarily capable and strategically prudent while concealing his real reasons for avoiding the city.